Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Olha Atamanova, and it's my pleasure to welcome you at Ukraine Media Center today. On the 20th of February 2014, the Russian aggression started against Ukraine. That was the day when the crossing of the Russian armed forces of the Ukrainian border was documented, and within all that period, the occupation authority tries to eradicate the Ukrainian identity in different parts of Ukraine, and of course they focus a lot on children. So today we will have a presentation of the report, Russia's policy of destroying the identity of children in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, and we will discuss the results of the year 2025. Let me introduce our speakers. Joining us today are Tetiana, Lychko, documentarian at the Almenda Center for Human Rights. Also joining us is Valentina Potapova, head of the national advocacy at the Almenda Center for Human Rights. And right about to join us is Polina Kustariova, a 20-year-old Crimean who left the occupied territory. So, Ms. Tetiana, I would like to give the floor to you and to find out in more profound details about your report. What is it about? Good afternoon. I would like to start with the fact that within 12 years after the beginning of occupation, and specifically within the last 4 years of the full-scale invasion, we've been hearing a lot about children in occupation, about their indoctrination, violation of the international law, and the children being deported to Russia. But all those news are of fragmentary nature, and the full realization of the situation taking place in the temporarily occupied territories is difficult. That's why we wanted to gather information in this report that would depict in detail the conditions in which children and youth ended up in temporarily occupied territories when it comes to education. In our report, we've analyzed a number of children studying in the temporarily occupied territories in the schools, the dynamics and the tendencies of spreading of youth and military movements in temporarily occupied territories, and the key changes taking place in the education process. And based on the results of the report, we may state that the year 2025 became yet another phase of intensification of the Russia's policy aiming at Russification and militarization of the education environment. Right away, I would like to state that all of the figures reflected in our report were collected from the open sources, because statistically, the official statistics in the Russian Federation continues being closed. We use the data published by the representatives of occupational administrations and the figures that they reflect in their documents, respectively. It creates certain challenges when it comes to faithfulness of the data and the risks for the children who stay in temporarily occupied territories. Talking about the data we've collected, as long as we've been using open sources, in the year 2025-2026, in temporarily occupied territories, there are 1,980 schools functioning, which transferred to Russian standards, and 582,000 children study in those schools, even a little bit more. all of those Ukrainian children are in fact deprived of a right to choose. They cannot choose the language of education and the education program. At the same time, they fear responsibility for not attending school operating under Russian standards, and respectively they are forced to study under Russian curricula. What are the key changes that have taken place in 2025? It's worth mentioning that Russia continues the talks about the important things aimed at Russification of Ukrainian children, and in the same manner they use music and cinema to impose love to Russia. However, based on the data that we've collected, there were key changes that have taken place when it comes to a number of trends. First of all, it's about implementation of the distorted historical narratives. How is it manifested? First is the switch to other textbooks on Russian history and world history. Those textbooks were brought to the temporarily occupied territories, and children studying in 5th to 11th grade, they study from those textbooks. The key trends that were reflected in those textbooks are the advances of the promotion on the concept of the self-sufficiency of Russian Federation and refuse of European-centric policy. In the same way, the new model is being implemented called History of the Area that positions temporarily occupied territories as integral parts of Russia. Meanwhile, ties with Ukraine are being systemically negated. Another area of development that should be emphasized when it comes to the changes that have taken place in 2022 are the ban on languages, Ukrainian language specifically, and percentage of the children who were studying in Ukrainian or had access to study of Ukrainian language diminished significantly. For example, in the temporarily occupied Crimean Peninsula, such number was below 1%. However, at the end of the year 2025, specifically starting from the 15th of December, Russian Federation made amendments to the federal curricula, to the federal education standards, and Ukrainian language was completely removed from those standards. It results in full eradication of Ukrainian identity from education space in temporarily occupied territory, which is respectively a violation of children's right to access to the study of their native language. Yet another thing documented in the changes of the education process was intensification of militarization of the curriculum. Specifically, all of the schools in temporarily occupied territories got the equipment for training sessions in such classes as the foundations of protection of homeland. Those are the dummies of AK, assault rifles, and different types of UAVs such as FPV drones that are being widely used in the war against Ukraine. For example, in the territory of temporarily occupied Crimea, 90% of the schools are being supplied with such kind of equipment. Amounts spent for that equal to about 139 million rubles from local and central budgets. As long as Russia supplies the materials, in the same way they support their human resources policies. So in October 2025, a number of measures were approved aiming at patriotic and spiritual education of the youth, which has a long-term nature lasting until 2028. And the key idea is to provide access to the so-called special military operation veterans to teaching such classes as patriotic and military education and youth military clubs that function at the platform of the schools. This fact enables engagement of the military who take part in the war against Ukraine in the curriculum process, education process, and creation of an image of such a veteran as a mentor, as a role model. Yet another issue in 2025 was intensification of engagement of the Russian Orthodox Church representatives in education process. We can track it through the implementation of a class called Spiritual and Moral Culture of Russia in the territory of the temporarily occupied Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. This class is aiming at forming or shaping traditional Russian values in children, in which service to the country is put above the human rights. And this class will be mandatory for training in all the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine starting next curriculum year. Yet another indicator of intensification of militarization of education process is the growth of the number of cadet classes. As of 2025, at least 479 cadet classes were established under the aegis of the Investigation Committee of Russian Federation, the Prosecutor's Office, and other law enforcement agencies. The key task of such agencies is to hold training classes with the children at schools, as well as active propaganda and stimulation of the children to enter the relevant higher educational institutions. For example, in Crimea, the number of cadet classes multiplied 202 times. If there were only 3 back in 2015, in 2025 their number is 306. In parallel with the militarization of education process, the occupier continues to actively involve children and youth in the youth organizations such as the Young Eagles of Russia, the Volunteers of Victory, and immense number of others. However, the biggest ones continue being such movements as Youth Army and the movement of the first ones. Youth Army or Yunarmia was being active since 2016, and they engage children from 8 to 16 years old. For the time being, the number of children engaged is above 2 million, including 44,000 children living in temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. For the activity of the movement, Russia allocates huge funds. For example, in the year 2025, more than 999 million of rubles were allocated, which equal to around $10 million. For the year 2026, the funding was increased and now amounts to about 16 million US dollars. And it's noteworthy that such funding is taking place within the state program to ensure the defense capacity of the country. That is another fact showing the real intentions of Russian Federation. The dynamic of spreading in the temporarily occupied territories is also impressive. In the temporarily occupied city of Sevastopol and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, it has grown significantly within the last years. At the same time, in the territory of temporarily occupied Zaporizhia and Kherson region, the indicators remain pretty low within the last couple of years, which again evidences the probable resistance on part of the population and difficulties experienced by the local occupational authorities when it comes to engagement of children in such movements. The movement of the first ones is the mass movement of the youth in Russian Federation that for the time being has about 13 million members, including 344,600 children from the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. In the same way, the number of members of the movement is growing, specifically in Crimea and Luhansk regions. For the function of this movement, the Russian Federation budget allocated about 217 million US dollars in 2025, and in 2026 the funding increased up to 289 million US dollars. What are those funds spent for? The campaigns of forced passportization of Ukrainian children in temporarily occupied territories under the slogan, "We are the citizens of Russia." In the same way, the budget funds are being spent for military game Zornitsa 2.0, in which children acquire skills related to real military professions such as a drone operator, sapper, combat medic, and others. In the regulations of the movement, there is a goal of its operation to shape their attitude to the defense of their homeland as their sacred duty in children, and respectively, the homeland in this case is considered to be Russian Federation, a notion that is imposed on Ukrainian children. So all those funds are allocated for shaping of the perception of Russia in these children and its protection as their sacred duty. Well, it's noteworthy that the activity of the movement of the first ones also covered the preschool education. The departments were opened in the kindergartens of Crimea and Enerhodar in temporarily occupied part of Zaporizhia region. The children aged 5 to 6 years were involved in operation of this movement, which again evidences the imposition of Russification and militarization of the children that totally negates the voluntary nature of the membership in this movement on part of the children. Additionally, the Russian Federation stimulates the involvement in such movements. For example, additional points in case of application to the higher educational institutions for the players of Zarnisa game and the members of the movement of the first ones, or participation in the championship, the pilots of the future. Within the last year, 9 universities of Russian Federation were involved in this program, and for the next year, the number of such universities who accept the activists of such movements with additional points in the Russian Federation, which can cause the educational migration of Ukrainian children from temporarily occupied territories to the territory of Russian Federation. These and other tools of youth policy are being funded from the budget of Russian Federation quite lavishly. For example, starting from the year 2014 until the year 2020, the budget of Russian Federation for the youth policy was from 700 million to 20 billion. However, the budget has increased almost twice until now, which is an evidence of the fact that Russia was preparing to the full-scale invasion, allocating additional resources for engagement and training of the children and youth. Back in, or for the year 2026, the federal budget of Russian Federation plans to allocate more than 78 billion rubles, which roughly amounts to 1 billion United States dollars. It seems like not so big of an amount. However, if we compare 1 billion US dollars to other amounts, it's twice as bigger as budget of Georgia allocated for their army, or more than twice as bigger as the military budget of Moldova. At the same time, together with the youth policy measures, the Russian Federation continues to engage children in military camps and specialized military and patriotic centers, which is happening through the Warrior Center, which continue being opening in 2026 and continue scaling up. According to the statements of the officials of the Russian Federation, until the year 2030, the Warrior Centers are supposed to be open in all of the temporarily occupied territories, and in the year 2025, the construction of such centers started in the territories of Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions. Investment of significant funds in not only the establishment of the centers, but large-scale construction of the military centers for the children and youth is an evidence of long-term plans of the Russian Federation to continue the war. On par with the preparation, on par with the propaganda, Russian Federation continues the memorialization policy of the veterans, of the so-called veterans of the special military operation within the project, the Desk of the Hero. More than 1,150 such hero desks were opened in temporarily occupied territories. In the temporarily occupied territory of Crimea, on top of the school desks, there are more than 200 memory boards, memorials, obelisks, and other objects opened dedicated to the military killed in the war against Ukraine. One example of just one school in the territory of temporarily occupied Crimea already evidences the scale. In one school alone, stands, school desks, obelisks, and other objects were open, dedicated to 38 persons. So just imagine this scale. And respectively, in the territory of temporarily occupied Donetsk region, there was the biggest number of such objects open, which exceeds 800 objects. These and other tools used by Russian Federation evidence a long-term policy of Russian Federation aiming at changing the identity of Ukrainian children in temporarily occupied territories, their militarization and preparation to the service in their law enforcement agencies and the military of Russian Federation. You can get familiarized with these facts and figures in our report, and also if you have any questions, it will be my pleasure to answer them. Thank you, Ms. Tetiana. Thank you for the detailed analytics, and I would like to give the floor to Polina. Polina, thank you for joining us. You're a Crimean who left the temporarily occupied territory, and of course we would like to ask you about your experience and to find out about the challenges you were facing and probably continue facing. Well, thank you for invitation to this event. Well, first of all, I would like to say that meanwhile I was looking through the presentation, when you experience it, it feels like you're alone and you don't feel the scale, but when you see the figures and the number of people affected by all those processes, you're getting goosebumps, because you see how bad it is in the temporarily occupied territories, and when you see the dry statistics, you get a more clear realization of it. I've been living in Crimea since my birth until the summer of 2025. I was able to study a couple of years in the period before occupation, and then all my life I've been studying in occupation. In essence, what can I say about the education under Russian rule? It's, it's like a big asylum where you get crazy and you join others who are crazy. So those who live in the temporarily occupied territories, now they are like cannibals who try to mimic normal people. All of the parents, the teachers, they are subject to Russian propaganda. They are adults, but they don't have proper skills of use of the internet, because let's be honest, not all of the adults know how to use the modern IT equipment, and other occupation where you cannot get a normal VPN, getting online is very difficult. That's why those people are being subjected to Russian propaganda, and after we get those people, the people who agree with the Russian policy, we get the biggest problem, because those people are going to educate and raise their children, and unfortunately you cannot find any kind of education worse than there, because what you've just heard is absolute truth, because I was witnessing the birth of all of those processes, all of those phases that were taking place while I was staying in Crimea. I remember everything Ukrainian being removed from our curriculum. Like Ukrainian language was removed right away, probably in May. in May. It was not already started in May of 2014, and starting from the next September, it was fully removed from the curriculum. In the same way, the Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian history, and everything related to Ukraine started being eradicated. Until the year 2022, the discussion of Ukraine in a positive key was a taboo topic. All those statements about 8 years and so on, they started growing after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Russia was trying to eradicate any memories of Ukraine. They were trying to pay more attention to the fact that Crimea and other occupied territories are Russian territory. So I can say that DPR and LPR, they wanted to depict them as separate countries and Crimea as a territory of Russia. In the history lessons, we frequently discussed that Catherine II got Crimea united with Russia, liberated it from the Turks. So I don't know, probably they were preparing a bridgehead for the full-scale invasion by such activities, and everything related to Ukraine was not discussed. But after the year 2022, in my school, very active militarization has started, and again, it was very prompt. You know, what Russia can do good is they can respond promptly to a lot of things, but it's not advantage for us. First, they've taken advantage of the fact that in temporarily occupied territories there were problems with Ukrainization because our state was not holding Ukrainization policy in those territories, and Russia very quickly captured the hearts and minds of the people there, imposing their narratives. Afterwards, there was a very quick occupation of Crimea. We'll remember how quick it was. And eventually, in the year 2022, we've seen the same in education process. Basically, in any processes, they responded very quickly. They put a lot of placards with the Zs, like all of our city was covered in their special military operation promotion campaigns. We started those talks about the important things, raising Russian flags, singing Russian anthem. The teachers quickly switched to the stories that in Ukraine or on Ukraine, as they said, there is a lot of Nazis, Banderites, and so on and so forth. Those ideas were in the air, but they were not so manifested. The people were afraid to touch this topic that was not beneficial for them objectively. But after that, an active propaganda campaign has started, and in every lesson it was discussed that Ukraine is a Russian territory, Crimea is a Russian territory. So basically the whole world is Russia. That's a very popular Russian statement. They put it on their t-shirts, and in order to convince people about that, they were holding those talks about important things. In my opinion, that's one of the worst classes that you could imagine, because there was a very interesting system of study. I don't know about other educational institutions, but in those educational institutions it was like that. A child, no matter what age, what grade, anyway, was supposed to make a report on a specific topic. So there was a number of children, and there was a topic assigned to everyone. For example, my topic was Ukrainian voluntary education of the anti-terrorist operation era, and there were standard statements about Azov servicemen killing innocent Russian boys, so the very typical Russian propaganda. And also, I was attending a discussion about the terrible West who tried to appropriate Russian resources, and any objective facts that confirm their irrationality, no one would listen to them. You could just listen to 30 crazy people talking to each other, say that there are Nazis inhabiting Ukraine and all the world belongs to Russia, but all the world is against Russia. So it's a standard, typical day in temporarily occupied territories. And after the talks about the important things, after the flag is raised, there are other classes starting, and other classes were, for example, native language. And our native language was not Ukrainian, not Crimean Tatar. Meanwhile, at the legislative level, those languages are considered to be regional languages, and they should be mandatory for study. But in fact, they were not studied whatsoever. And currently, in Crimea, for what I know, well, I know for sure there is no single Ukrainian school. Our one was the last one, and Ukrainian language study was optional. When it comes to Crimean Tatar language, the Kyrgyz are the native population of Crimea, but Russia shows no respect to them whatsoever. They are being forgotten in all of the history lessons. Nothing is being told about them in the history lessons, and thus we can once again witness the level of Russian, like cannibal nature, Russian activity aiming at eradication of other nationalities. When it comes to Crimean Tatar language, currently it's being taught in 2 schools in Simferopol. However, in one school it's not yet confirmed, so probably it's only 1 school left. And it's another significant problem, because it's not only us who's losing our population, but also Kyrgyz, who are less numerous than us, and unfortunately that they don't have their own state, and they cannot fully influence those processes taking place in Crimea, because they have more loyal attitude to the Ukrainians, because it's more difficult to tell a Ukrainian from Russian. Because in fact you can fake, but you can do whatever you want. But Crimean Tatars, they end up under supervision, under their surveillance right away. They have no freedom whatsoever. And in the school there is one thought, like Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars are the peoples that arrived at Crimea, and the only real existing people is the people of Russia, so everyone is supposed to be Russian. I dislike this word Ruski, and many people succumb to those ideas. Many people start supporting this idea. The Ukrainians residing there, in my class there were around 15 people probably with Ukrainian last names, whose relatives would be living in non-occupied territory of Ukraine, the temporary under Ukrainian control. But after the beginning of occupation, they all stayed in Crimea, because Russia is real good in imposing this idea on the people. The people are not really Ukrainian, they are not really Crimean Tatars. You know, that they were able to impose that idea on Buryats as well, because otherwise why would Buryats be fighting for Russia? That's the biggest threat emanating from Russia. In my opinion, the biggest threat is not of military nature, it's their ability to intensify their propaganda, because shouldn't it be so, there would be no such a large number of pro-Russian thoughts, ugly pro-Russian thoughts, and many circumvented people in the temporarily occupied territories. And I think even the global community would be on our side, but otherwise those people trust in Russian propaganda statements. They are afraid on Russia, or somehow even support Russia, as we can see based on the examples from the Olympic Games. And unfortunately we can see Russia influencing everybody. But again, if we rely upon the global examples, just imagine what can happen to a child who have an opinion of their own, and they're being pressed upon, and they're being taught all the time that they are Russians, that they need to defend Russia, and they should go to war and die for Russia. Well, for me, as I was living there and now that I'm living here, it was the most tragic thing, because always when we talk about children, we all understand that in fact it's about our future that we're losing now. The people that we all pity because they are not guilty of ending up in that situation. It's not their fault that they were occupied. It's not their fault that they are being forced to switch sides to come to Russian side. They are not guilty of being forced to learn, to study what they learn, and it's not their fault that they don't have access to other information that could convince them otherwise. But unfortunately, we don't have sufficient level of propaganda to counter Russian propaganda. So currently this problem will remain, and year to year we will see bigger figures, bigger budgets for propaganda, bigger budgets for those Young Eagles organizations and other paraphernalia, and then we'll see deterioration of statistics when it comes to more youth switching to Russian side, unless we start implementing some measures against Russia aimed at direct propaganda in temporarily occupied territories and direct imposition of our ideas and attempts to involve the youth in pro-Ukrainian movements, pro-Ukrainian processes. Well, it's very interesting to find out how did you come up with that idea to leave. I understand it's a very difficult story, so how have you come up from the first moment of idea until its implementation? How did it take place? Well, I had that idea from the very beginning, either to continue fighting in Crimea or continue fighting in the territory under Ukrainian control. But in fact, in Crimea, my mental condition was deteriorating significantly. You know, if you live in an asylum, it's very difficult not to start going crazy together with the rest of the. So I couldn't take it mentally, and unfortunately my activities didn't yield any results, because a lot of people who were intimidated, a lot of people who don't want to do the things they could have done, both in terms of enlightenment and the resistance. And objectively, I've realized that I would be more useful in the territory under Ukrainian control. So I've realized if I continue staying in Crimea, I would remain the same person with no contribution to the victory over Russia. But again, as I started gathering my things, preparing to leave, I had to get in touch with the volunteers. You know, we have this paranoia of a person's being occupied. Everybody is afraid that another person by your side turns out to be a Russian agent. So I was not trusting volunteer organizations. I decided to contact the embassy directly. I decided there could be no Russian agents in the embassy. I was still not confident, but again, those people, you know, they were playing on the part of their country's citizens. So as I left for Kazakhstan, I started experiencing problems with the Ukrainian embassy. But as soon as I left, I started solving problems as they were coming, and I keep sorting them out. However, I don't have any more issues related to paperwork, which makes me happy. And now seems like my life is getting better gradually. I'm getting a clear plan of how can I contribute all that big business. Well, we've heard about a lot of issues from Polina, a lot of things that seem to be snowballing, with the number of problems only growing year to year. So can you please give us a professional view of what should be done specifically on part of the state and part of the government. Well, as Polina was saying, she was mentioning sad and terrible things, but I continued smiling, because if you sit by the side of a person who was staying in occupation for almost 12 years, but was able to preserve such an aspiration to freedom, aspiration to democratic things, aspiration to being a person thinking critically, it was like a breath of a fresh air, and I was smiling as she was talking in that life and the asylum. But really, staying in temporarily occupied territory is a huge challenge, and I really want to thank Polina for going public, because to me it seems that the majority of Ukrainian society, they don't understand what's going on in occupation. The majority of the state authorities, they don't understand what's going on in occupation, and the majority of the state authorities don't understand that there is a silent generation being raised, and not all of them are being subjected to Russian propaganda, and more intense efforts are needed on part of the Ukrainian government for the youth staying there to feel that the Ukrainian state is ready to welcome them. We've been saying a lot that there should be people remaining there who would open the doors for us when we come back, and we never said, like, we never appealed to the youth, continue the resistance or counter Ukraine. But now I understand that it was not quite right. I'm not saying that the people with the pro-Ukrainian position who stay there, I'm not saying they should all leave immediately. It's up to every single person specifically, but our organization says, like, let's start pulling our children from there, from occupation. It's important to preserve the human resources that Ukraine is missing so badly now. I would like to remind you about a survey that we've held in 2025 among the students. We've surveyed more than 1,300 students, and there was a question: what stimulated you to leave? What stimulated you to apply for Ukrainian higher educational institutions? And more than half said that it was about the patriotic sentiment. And then there was a question: what challenges were you facing? And there was that answer that Polina mentioned about the embassy. They said when they had the first contact with Ukraine through the embassy or consular department, they were not understood there. And there were questions like, why did you take a passport of Russian Federation? Why are you now applying to us? Meanwhile, you're Russian citizens now. And those young people, I recall the story of a young female, Julieta, who was trying to prove that she was not Russian citizen, but she had a Russian passport, and she was unable to make it in the temporarily occupied territory without Russian passport, but she wanted to study in Ukraine. And this is the same thing that Polina is reiterating. So in my opinion, we can discuss it for long hours, but without the special government policy to reintegrate children from the temporarily occupied territory. I would call this policy the renewal of the human resources of Ukraine. And it's not about education. Our organization, we are involved in education matters, but now we understand that education is just a way to get them involved. For example, Polina, she doesn't want to enter a higher educational institution. Well, she just doesn't. That's why we need to tell the youth to leave, but to leave for where? Where you will be told that you are a Russian citizen at the embassy, or where you will be told at a higher educational institution that they don't need you because you were supposed or you are supposed to do something. No, there should be a government policy aiming at renewal of the human resources of Ukraine at the account of the youth from temporarily occupied territories. You've just seen the figures. The figures are impressive. Almost 1.5 million children. And if we add youth, well, statistically, youth may be up to different age, maybe up to 40, but let's count up to 35 years. That's youth. We need to pull them out of there, because again, there is something new. The combination of military education with religious education. Should I mention Taliban, or the audience is already realizing where Russian Federation is moving to? Because that's a new thing. It never existed within the last 12 years, and that's a real horrific thing. That's why we need to pull our people out of there. We need specialized programs. We need their reports at the level of the parliament. We need systemic government solutions. I'm not going to tell about the tools that our organization is advising. They are clearly outlined in our political reviews, our recommendations. And also, I would like to give an opportunity for the journalists from the floor to ask their questions. But again, we need this specialized program to pull the children and youth from the temporarily occupied territories. It should be a matter of national security, a priority program for the state of Ukraine. Thank you, Ms. Valentina. And now let's pass the microphone to the floor. Dear friends, now you have an opportunity to ask your questions. In case you have any, raise your hands, and we'll give a mic to you. Good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation of this important report. My name is Vladislav Gavrilov. I'm a researcher, and I would like to give a comment and probably ask a question that would continue the statement of Ms. Valentina to emphasize it. Look, when we get familiarized with your reports, with your presentations, we see the systemic nature of Russian crime. We see the growth of funding, the growth of number of children involved in paramilitary organizations, the growth of number of Russian officials and teachers who continue being sent infinitely to those temporarily occupied territories, and we see the lack of systemic nature when it comes to work with our children from temporarily occupied territories and from non-occupied territories, because it may be my personal opinion, but I'm not seeing any sustainable systemic policy when it comes to education of our children, even in the territory under Ukrainian control. You know, in science we say thesis and statement and anti-statement. We can hear a statement by Russian Federation, but we don't have an anti-statement of our own. So how important is it to prioritize such program at the state level, and to say that it's really important in our demographic strategy of development to emphasize that issue, the children's and youth policy from the Ukrainian perspective, and what methods can be acceptable and feasible to build this system. Thank you. Well, I'm not going to delve into methods and techniques because I'm no specialist when it comes to the development of those techniques, but I agree 100% with what you've just said. And now what can be done? I can tell you that where our organization and the rest of other organizations who work with children and youth is involved, we found full understanding with the Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights, but the special reports of the Commissioner when it comes to education of the children in temporarily occupied territories, and now is the only way when they leave. You know, they leave using different pathways, but that's the path that the state sees, let's put it like that. But again, that special report was supposed to be transformed into a strategy or a concept. And the initiator of such strategy or concept was supposed to be respectively a Ministry of Education, or maybe the Ministry of the Development of Communities, or someone else, someone who can submit it to the review of the Cabinet of Ministers. But now, after a year has passed, no one is submitting that strategy or concept for the Cabinet of Ministers. Then we have a lot of task forces who develop different things. So there is no synergy, there is no inter-ministry commission. There is no multidisciplinary commission, and it's about the national security of Ukraine. You've mentioned it right, that our demographic crisis is so profound that we don't see the catastrophe. It's not a crisis, it's a catastrophe. Some part of our children left abroad, some part of our children ended up in occupation. And I've calculated, according to the data, as of January 2022, 42% of Ukrainian children are currently staying in either in other countries or other occupation, 42%. So what are we gonna do in 15 years? Tell me, please. I don't know. I don't know which doors should I knock to make sure that this issue is put as the priority, not at the level of the Ministry of Education, not at the level of the Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights. I can see the representatives of their office, the audience, but at the level of National Security and Defense Council, at the level of the Parliament, at the level of the Presidential Office, this is where it should be prioritized. The necessity to create those programs, and then we will be able to proceed to the methods and techniques. Let's first come up with the political decision, and then we'll come up with the specialists who can develop those methods. But for the time being, we don't have this anti-statement, as you're saying. We don't have this political will, and it's yet another report. There was another report presented by another organizations with source, and within 4 years they've gathered a lot of evidences from different people, from the school children, from the parents, from the teachers. So again, it's all about the political will. Thank you, Ms. Valentina. Dear audience, if you have any questions, please let us know.
One moment. Please.
Thank you for doing this. My name is Gakushi Fujwala from the Asahi Shimbun Japanese newspaper. What do you think Russia's ultimate goal in militarizing children, and what could be worst consequences of that? Thank you.
Well, it's quite easy and simple. The main goal of Russia in all of their attempts is to create more resources to convince the final number of people in their rightfulness and their right to invade other countries, other territories, to wage a war and to kill. They just want to legalize their violence, they want to legalize their occupation, and they want to legalize their terrible anti-humane deeds. So the ultimate goal of their militarization is to raise population who would support the war or who would be ready to wage the war, and to demonstrate that in occupied territories all of the population supports them, and therefore occupation of other countries is potentially possible, killing of other people is potentially possible because people continue supporting Russia. So the ultimate goal of their propaganda is to legalize that crime against humanity. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, and I would like to thank you for this profound conversation, for this meeting. I would like to thank all those who work on this topic, and I would like to thank Polina specifically for the way that you've made, and thank you for being with us today. Thank you, dear friends, and obviously we would like to thank the security and defense forces, thanks to whom we can gather here and discuss important topics. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.